Welcome to Run Long, Run Healthy. I'm Thomas Watson, and every week, along with my co-host, Brady Homer, we break down the latest in sports science research and how everyday runners like ourselves can apply it to our run training and lives. In today's episode, we're exploring the science of post-run nutrition, and we're going to discuss a framework called the 4 R's framework, which any runner can apply to their post-run nutrition regime to make sure you're ticking all the boxes when it comes to recovering properly after your run and not leaving anything on the table. As always, please let us know what you think of this episode if you have any questions or comments. And please consider subscribing to the Run Long, Run Healthy newsletter. It goes out every week. It's written by Brady. It's all the latest new stuff he's found in the world of sports science and running science. There's free and there's paid versions. You can find it over on marathonhandbook.com or on Substack. I learn at least one new thing every week. I really enjoy reading it. Check it out. And here's our conversation on post-run nutrition. Okay, Brady, why should runners be interested in post-run nutrition?
If you don't get your post-run nutrition right, I would say that you are not fully optimizing training. You're not fully adapting and not getting as much out of your workout as you possibly could. I think a lot of runners neglect it. And today we're going to talk about strategies that runners can utilize to refuel properly, recover properly, and achieve personal bests that way.
Okay, and you talk about strategies. So there's a framework that's called the 4 R's framework, which I believe has been around for a while. And there's been a recent review paper out that basically revisits it and maybe updates parts of it or summarizes it. Why don't you take us through the story of the 4 R's?
So the 4 R's, yes, it was this framework proposed by a few researchers, authors in the field of sports nutrition. Lead authors on this review that we're going to be discussing today, Diego Bonilla and Jeffrey Stout. And so, introduced in 2020, so about 5 years ago now, and then they've updated this framework since to kind of include this new concept of allostasis we'll talk about. But the 4 R's framework, it's just a mnemonic to emphasize the 4 R's of sports nutrition, which are rehydrate, refuel, repair, and recuperate or rest. And it's this interesting framework, easy way to remember kind of the 4 things that athletes need to focus on after exercise. And I think that's what we really want to emphasize here is there's so much to talk about in terms of sports nutrition these days, fueling before exercise, what should you eat, what should you eat during. But this review specifically in this framework is focused on the post-exercise window. So what should you do after your workout, in the 24 hours after to ensure proper recovery and prepare not only for the next training session, but then optimize, the adaptations that you achieved or tried to achieve during the training session beforehand.
So it's quite a nice framework. Basically, you can go through the 4 different parts of it. And as long as you're ticking all the boxes, you're not leaving anything on the table, I guess, in terms of recovery from a nutrition perspective. Where do you want to go to first? Should we discuss allostasis or do you want to get into the 4 R's right away?
I think we should discuss the concept of allostasis that the authors proposed in this article or that they kind of explain in this article, because I think it's important in order to frame the 4 R's and really emphasize the importance of this framework. So allostasis is basically this process of resetting biological systems after a stress, or essentially kind of achieving balance through change. Many listeners may be familiar with the concept of homeostasis, and in biology, that basically just refers to the idea of getting the body back to normal. So if I walk outside, it's summer here, I live in Texas, it's 105 degrees during the day. If I walk outside, my body temperature is going to start to rise. And in order to bring myself back to homeostasis, my normal body temperature, I'm going to start sweating and do a few other physiological things that will try to bring my body temperature back down. And that will achieve homeostasis. So back to balance, back to baseline. Allostasis is essentially adapting to the stress to get better and in a way that your body changes. So, it's really, in an easy way or a more, a simpler way, it's adapting to training. We put our body through a ton of stress by running. We do intervals, we do long runs, And we don't really want to get back to homeostasis after the run. We want to get better. We want our body to adapt in certain ways to achieve this new state of, this new physiological state, this new biological state that's better than before. So that is allostasis, essentially, in a nutshell. And they also kind of coined this new term called cacostasis, and this is basically a maladaptive stress response. So if you don't do these 4 Rs correctly, and we'll talk about how to do those correctly, but you will get a maladaptive stress response. So that could contribute to things like overtraining. Many people may have heard of that, or injury, or relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S. Things that basically are, the opposite of what you want. You want to adapt to stress. You don't want to break your body down and maladapt, which is kind of classically what we refer to as overtraining. And so by introducing this concept then of allostasis, they frame the 4 Rs in terms of if you do these right, day after day, training session after training session, hopefully you achieve allostasis and not the opposite, which would be the cacostasis phrase that they kind of coin.
Okay, cool. Good to know. So let's get into the 4 Rs. And the first R, I don't know if I guess these are in order, basically in terms of what the order you should address them after exercise. So the first one's rehydrate, fluid replacement. What are the findings and recommendations from the paper on rehydration?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, all of these, they can kind of occur in the order that we present them, but some of them obviously will be combined if we're talking about nutrition and hydration. So the first R, rehydration or fluid replacement. So the goal here is restore hydration after exercise to counter the fluids you've lost and the electrolytes that you have lost. This will obviously be, I think, out of all of the 4 Rs that we're going to discuss, probably the most individual because, as you know, everybody has a different sweat rate, massively different sweat rates based on body size, male and female, but also the environmental conditions. I mean, even from day to day, the amount that you sweat can differ widely. So this may include some trial and error for many people in terms of how much you need to hydrate, how much electrolytes you need. But the general recommendation here is to consume 150% of the body mass lost in fluids after exercise. So an example of this would be they recommend drinking 1.5 liters of water for every pound of body weight you lose in the 4 hours after exercise. So basically this is not just replacing the fluids, but sort of replacing them times, 1.5. And how do you know how much you lost, during a run? Well, the easy way to do this would just be to weigh yourself before and after a run. I know when you get into talking about, weight and weighing yourself every day as runners, that can kind of be a sensitive topic. And so I don't think somebody needs to do this every day, but, maybe under certain different environmental conditions, you weigh yourself once a week or so and say, okay, well, I lose about, 4 pounds maybe on an hour run. So in that case, when I come back from my run, I would want to drink 6 liters of water in the ensuing 4 hours. That would kind of be a practical recommendation there. So pre and post weighing, if people are interested in determining how much they lose, that's a way to do it. Obviously, you want to weigh yourself without clothes on because your clothes are going to absorb some of that sweat that you have on you. And, it's not just water. So obviously hydration involves a lot more than just water. Carbohydrates and electrolytes in that post-exercise hydration are kind of key. So sodium is the main electrolyte people want to focus on, although many hydration drinks also contain some potassium, some magnesium, which are good as well. But sodium is the primary one there. 400 to 700 milligrams of sodium per liter of water is sort of the recommendation there. There are, interestingly, I haven't used any of these myself, Thomas. I don't know if you have any experience, but, sweat tests that you can buy to sort of determine the composition of your sweat. I'd be interested to do that, but it's not something I've done. I don't really know if people need to get that granular in terms of thinking about their hydration, just, kind of drink to taste in terms of the saltiness of your drink. So 400 to 700 milligrams of sodium in there, and some carbohydrates as well, which actually do enhance hydration. So if you add carbs to something, you're gonna absorb the sodium and the fluids better. a 6% carbohydrate solution is typically, what they recommend. But maybe, if you're just hydrating with something after a run, something with 20 to 50 grams maybe of carbohydrates per liter would probably be a good recommendation there. Yeah, so why do people want to rehydrate? How does this kind of serve to promote allostasis or promote recovery? It, returns your plasma volume back to normal, supports your cardiac output and your heart rate, helps with thermoregulation. So not just during exercise, but also after. And then, again, the sodium and the carbs, the recommendation there is to help promote fluid retention. So it's better than just drinking plain water, although people can obviously just drink water if you prefer.
I think it's quite interesting. The volume of water listed here, it sounds like a lot, 1.5 liters per kilogram of body weight lost, but I think it's over 4 hours after the exercise. So when you actually add it up, and I think if you just measure naturally how much you'd be inclined to drink after going for a run, it's probably not far off what the recommendation here would be anyway.
Absolutely. And thanks for correcting me there, Thomas. I actually said 1.5 liters per pound, but it's 1.5 liters per kilogram, which is kind of a key distinction. So it would be about half of the amount that I listed when I gave my example. So 1.5 liters per every about 2 pounds of water that you lose.
And it's worth mentioning here, we'll go through the four, and then we're going to talk about like practical strategies and what it would look like for most runners at different times of the day to tick all these boxes. But let's move on to number two, refuel, which is all about energy availability. So what have we learned there?
Yeah, refueling. I think that's kind of the favorite thing that runners like to do, and everybody knows the importance of refueling after a run, eating after a run. So the goal here is to restore glycogen and provide energy for immune support, tissue repair, basically, restore what you burned during that exercise bout. This will, again, obviously depend on, how long your workout is, how intense it was. That will determine the extent of your glycogen depletion and how much, muscle damage and things like that you need to recover. But the recommendation here about a carb intake of 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass per hour, again, in that 4-hour post-exercise window. And they also recommend to include at least one high-carb meal within 2 hours of exercise. So, I think we've probably talked about this before when in one of our episodes on protein for endurance athletes, where it might not matter as much when you take your protein after exercise, but for carbs it really does, and you want to get those in as quickly as possible after your exercise bout. So that's why they isolate that 4-hour window, and again, reiterate, within 2 hours at least, try to get a high carbohydrate meal. Again, 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass per hour. So let's just use an example of somebody who weighs 70 kilograms. It's about 150 pounds or so. That means they would probably want to consume about 80 grams of carbs per hour in the 4 hours after exercise. And if you eat a meal, that contains a lot of carbs, some rice, bread, that might contain, 200 to 300 grams of carbs. That almost gets you there. So just kind of a practical example there. So another strategy now, I just focused on carbs, but if people are eating a meal after exercise, it's probably going to contain some fat, some protein as well. I mean, that it kind of makes sense. And protein is important for refueling, but we're going to talk about protein in the next R. However, if you don't just want to consume a carbohydrate-only meal or carbohydrate-only bar or beverage after a workout, you can do carbohydrates combined with protein. And caffeine actually, which helps enhance glycogen replenishment, and the protein actually helps enhance glycogen replenishment as well. So combining carbs with protein and caffeine will help that. And if you're doing that, you could do slightly less carbs, so about 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, and then 0.5 gram per kilogram of protein, and that will help enhance muscle glycogen replenishment. I know we're doing a lot of ratios here, so just as kind of a practical example, if you're having maybe say a snack after a workout, 50 to 60 or 70 grams of carbs, and then maybe 30 to 40 grams of protein. That would be a hefty post-workout snack that should promote recovery. And then the meal, it's going to be a little bit more than that, maybe twice that much. Caffeine, if you prefer, after exercise, that does seem to enhance glycogen replenishment a little bit. And there's one more thing that people can include with their either meal, shake, snack after an exercise, which we touched upon last week or 2 weeks ago, which is creatine. So combining creatine with carbohydrates also will enhance glycogen replenishment. And here, 5 to 10 grams maybe in your post-workout meal is ideal. And if you have a really, really hard training session and you're recovering from, say, a competition, the authors actually recommend that 20 grams during that day split into 5 equal doses. So if people are willing to experiment with those higher doses of creatine, you can go ahead and do that as well. But that seems to enhance glycogen replenishment in that 24 hours. And so that's sort of the recommendation. You don't need that 20 grams right in the 4 hours. You can kind of spread it throughout the day. Again, that might be more ideal if, say, you like just ran a marathon or you ran a really, really, really hard training session, perhaps after your long run. I think that runners could kind of take that to heart there and maybe just one day of the week do a little bit more creatine, but 5 to 10 grams also seems to be okay. Wanted to mention a few things that the authors mention in terms of what people should consider in terms of the carbohydrates. I sort of mentioned these, but how long is it going to be until your next training session of the competition? If you're exercising again or competing again on the same day, that glycogen replenishment becomes even more crucial. So you want to rapidly replenish glycogen, get as much as you can in as little bit of time to really kickstart that process. The adaptations that you're seeking. So carbohydrates are important post-exercise, but there is some literature, and I'm not necessarily for this strategy as much, but in favor of restricting carbohydrates after a workout if your primary goal, say, is weight loss or fat loss or optimizing fat burning or mitochondrial adaptations. Maybe delaying your carb intake for a few hours after exercise could be beneficial, but that's not really ideal from a performance perspective, but maybe just from I'm just training for fitness or like, purposefully doing a depletion run or something, maybe. So something to consider. And then whether you consume carbs before or during. So something interesting is that if you ate, say, breakfast, I know we were just talking before we started recording that you like to eat breakfast before your run. If you have a breakfast or a snack before your run and fuel adequately during the run, refueling after actually becomes less important because you're really not in as much of an energy deficit. You haven't depleted your glycogen stores as much because you've eaten something before and or during. And so that post-exercise glycogen replenishment, while still important, becomes less important if you've eaten something during a workout. So if you're someone who exercises fasted all the time, yeah, after you finish your workout, eat something right away. If you ate during or before, less important. Obviously, you should eat afterwards just to help recover, but it's less important and you don't have to be as sort of neurotic about timing in that respect.
Cool. Let's move on to number 3, repair.
Repair. This has to do all with tissue regeneration. So whereas Refuel kind of mainly focused on glycogen replenishment, repair focuses on repairing muscle tissue, stimulating muscle protein synthesis, helping to not only rebuild muscle tissue, if you're running or engaging in strength training, but then also kind of help avoid injury. And protein is the key player here. Protein is going to help with that tissue regeneration, muscle repair, muscle protein synthesis. And I think a lot of the time though, when people hear about muscle protein synthesis, especially runners think about it, they think, oh, I don't really need muscle protein synthesis. I didn't just like lift a heavy weight in the gym and I'm not really trying to get bulky or build up. But muscle protein synthesis doesn't just mean building more muscle. We have proteins, mitochondrial proteins need to be synthesized in order to make new, stronger, denser mitochondria. So enhancing muscle protein synthesis also means you're enhancing the proteins that are responsible for making new mitochondria. So I think runners should really reframe this in terms of emphasizing the importance of protein to build new proteins that help with aerobic exercise adaptations, not just getting bigger, stronger muscles. I think we need to kind of ditch that framework as runners. So the recommendations here for protein intake after exercise: 0.3 to 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. So in terms of a practical or an absolute dose, 30 to 40 grams of protein in that post-exercise meal or more. People can eat more protein. There's not really a limit in terms of how much your body can use. So if you eat a meal and it has 50, 60, or 70, that's all good too. But a minimum of probably 30 to 40 seems to be supported by the literature there. Again, taking that protein with some creatine, 5 to 10 gram dose also will help support that cell repair and growth. And then in terms of where your protein sources come from, there aren't really recommendations there. If you're a plant-based athlete, get it from beans and grains. If you're omnivorous, meat, eggs, cheese, also beans and grains are healthy too. So sources don't appear to matter there. You could have a protein shake as well. Aside from protein, then, there are some supplements that may support sort of recovery, reducing muscle damage. Some of them have decent evidence, based on what I've read, but some of them don't. So here, I'll just list a few that the authors mentioned. Tart cherry juice is one. Omega-3 fatty acids, nitrates, such as beetroot juice. That's a common supplement that runners like to use. Polyphenols, those are present in things like cocoa. Blueberries is also kind of a favorite. And ashwagandha is an interesting supplement. I think, Thomas, you and I have probably touched on ashwagandha before, but this is sort of what's known as an adaptogen, and it's an herb. And they recommend 300 to 500 milligrams per day to kind of support regeneration, adaptation. I actually take ashwagandha Monday through Friday. I take that as part of my supplements, and it seems to somewhat help support recovery. So just kind of an anecdotal experience there. But this regeneration and repair part of the framework is important for, yes, building larger muscles if that is your goal, but stronger muscles as well. So if you hit the gym, but also reducing muscle soreness, enhance connective tissue recovery, basically just rebuilds your body. Endurance exercise really does break down a lot of proteins, more than runners might think it does. And so it's just as important for us to get protein after our workout as it is for somebody going to the gym a few times per week.
And in terms of timing for this protein, is it the same 4-hour window we're talking that we discussed in the carbs?
That's going to be ideal. I think that the sooner that you can eat it after a workout, the better. And so, yes, focus on this 4-hour post-exercise window, I think is what the framework would emphasize there.
Cool. Let's go into the fourth and final quadrant of the 4 hours, which is recuperate, pre-sleep nutrition and system recovery.
Yes, so recuperate, that can involve, a lot of things. It's both passive and active recovery. So sometimes the best thing for runners to do to recover is to do nothing. I know that that's sometimes hard for us to do. We always want to be foam rolling or sitting in our Normatec boots, but oftentimes sitting on the couch just watching TV is just as good. So recovery, one aspect of that is just time, giving yourself enough time between one workout and the next one to recover, but also sleeping enough. And then also this idea of pre-sleep nutrition, which is kind of interesting, and I'm excited to get into that because there are things that you can do before sleep, not only to promote healthy sleep, but also to optimize your recovery overnight. And that involves certain nutrition strategies as well, things that you can add as well as some things that you can avoid. So some of the things to avoid, that would be excessive caffeine late in the day and alcohol as well. Alcohol, I think at one point people thought that it was this sort of sleep promoting substance, when in reality it may make you feel tired, but it's really not doing anything to help your sleep. It's actually making your sleep worse in terms of sleep quality and your ability to recover. So avoiding alcohol at night, late in the afternoon, as well as avoiding caffeine, within 4 hours of bedtime, those two things are going to be optimal to promote sleep, which in turn will help you recover better from your workout. There are also things that you can eat before sleep to sort of help promote overnight recovery. And one of the main things here is pre-sleep protein. And there's actually a lot of interesting research regarding pre-sleep protein. What essentially that just means is taking 20, 30, or 40 grams of protein about 30 or 60 minutes before you go to bed. Now, I know a lot of people might be thinking, I'm told not to eat before bed because that's going to harm my sleep. But a small snack that has some protein in there really isn't going to hamper your sleep quality that much. So here we're talking like one or two, maybe a protein bar or two, or maybe a cup of Greek yogurt with some granola, or a protein shake, or maybe just like a few slices of turkey. We're not talking eating an entire meal 30 minutes before you go to bed, but eating protein right before you go to bed, it represents another opportunity to get an additional dose of protein. But then there have also been studies showing that it promotes protein synthesis overnight, and it actually helps you recover better if you have some protein before sleep. So I think that's one recommendation that, if people are eating a few hours before bed and maybe going to bed a little hungry, have a small protein snack. You're doing yourself some good. You're not going to bed hungry, and you're also promoting recovery and enhancing some of your adaptations to training. And
Okay.
then, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to wrap up, but
Sure.
if I'm
Just
skipping over anything in recovery, let me know.
Now, just a few supplements that the authors mentioned. I think, it's always fun to talk about supplements that might promote sleep. So there's ashwagandha again. They mentioned that. They mentioned tart cherry juice, kiwi fruit, actually, and then valerian root and omega-3s. So similar to the ones we just discussed for, muscle regeneration, but those might also help promote sleep and promote recovery as well.
Cool. Kiwi fruit is a new one on me for helping you fall asleep at night.
You've been using kiwi fruit, you mean?
No,
Oh,
I've
okay.
never heard that was a sleep aid. I'll need to try it.
Yeah, there's some decent research there. So maybe a kiwi or two before bed. See how it works.
Right, Brady. So we've been through the science, we've covered the 4 R's, and I guess now we can talk about how both of us approach this and whether we're doing it right or wrong. Basically, we can grade ourselves. Slightly embarrassed to find out what my grade is, but maybe you can talk about. I know you've probably got this all down pat and optimized already. So I think you're a morning runner generally, right? So how do you try and tick off the 4 R's with your post-run nutrition?
Yeah, so I am a morning runner, and sometimes I'll train in the afternoon, but for the most part, it's in the morning. Generally, depending on the phase of training I'm in, I'm not going to eat. So for this scenario, for the sake of our discussion, let's just say I'm not eating anything before my run, which is typically the case. I might have a little bit of honey in my coffee or like half of a energy gel, but it's generally not something that substantial. So I'm going to finish my morning run, and what I'm doing immediately after is, kind of in the order that we discussed them, is the hydration. So I'll get back from my run, and to be honest, I'm not as maybe methodical as I maybe should be. As we've discussed this 4 R's framework, I'm not as methodical about it. I sort of just drink to thirst. I'm not, seeing how much I lost and then trying to calculate it, although maybe, again, something I could start doing. But I'm pretty much drinking to thirst, just water and electrolytes afterwards. One thing I have really been focusing on lately, though, is getting in some food immediately after my run. Unfortunately, I'm typically not that hungry. So, what really is appetizing for me, I kind of go to nutrition bars, and that really serves as my breakfast, as kind of a bridge to lunch, which I'll typically eat a few hours after my run. So, I have a variety of protein and carbohydrate bars sort of in my pantry, and I'll just take two of those essentially and have two of those after my run. That gets me anywhere from 500 to 600 calories, probably 30 to 40 grams of protein, 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrate, depending on what bar I choose. So it's a decent post-exercise snack. It's not a full meal, and it's probably not ideal, but it sort of stimulates my appetite a little bit and gets me to lunch instead of, fasting, which I sometimes used to do, which certainly is not ideal. So that's sort of my post-exercise. That's part of my, I touched upon my rehydration, kind of just drinking to thirst, my refuel, which is the bars that contain carbohydrates, and also the protein as well. So I've got the repair covered there too. I also do my post-exercise. It's not necessarily a protein shake because I don't put protein in there, but I have a greens powder and I put creatine in there as well, and I take it with my supplements. So there, I'm also touching upon the regenerate aspect of there by getting my creatine in, and I take 5 grams of creatine. I think that immediately after, my workout, I'm also kind of helping with this recuperation process. I also often take my dog for a walk, so it's a little bit of a active recovery maybe before I start the workday. But then later in the day, how am I going about this recuperate and rest? At nighttime, I don't really have this elaborate sleep routine, but sometimes I do take a supplement or two to help promote sleep, something with magnesium in there, maybe something with some herbs that are purported to help sleep. The evidence there is kind of maybe not as strong, but just in general, having a wind down routine that is not very methodical, but just trying to relax at night and put myself into a good state before sleep. I wear an eye mask overnight, keep the room cool, all those things for sleep hygiene. But just try to get 6 to 8 hours of sleep per night. As you know, being a busy guy, with a family running a business. It's not easy to always get as much sleep as you need, but you do your best and sometimes nap during the day if you get a chance to do that. So again, I think it's pseudo methodical. What I like to do, I think I've refined a lot of things in terms of especially the nutrition, the repair, and the refueling aspects of my post run nutrition. That has really improved in the last few years. So yeah, I'd love to hear how yours is similar or how it differs. I know we differ in terms of maybe when our runs occur during the day, so I'd love to hear what your framework looks like.
Yes, well, I would say I'd give you a pretty high score, actually. Just looking at what you've just told me and looking at the 4 Rs, and I'm a little bit jealous. So yeah, my situation is it's much more all over the place than you, unfortunately, and maybe a few listeners can relate. Um, Basically, between work and then we've got 3 little kids right now at home. Naturally, I'm a morning run person, and I, when it when it's possible, I would be out the door at 5 or 6 a.m. to go for a long run. But right now, those opportunities are far and few between. So I'm trying to balance when I do my runs, I'm thinking about nutrition and also when I'm going to have energy for the run because I find early mornings are easy. Post meals aren't so fun, aren't so easy. But then I've got work, and then I'm also thinking about energy in terms of I've got to have energy to do my work as I don't want to burn myself out running. And then I guess the other little constraint I always consider is family meal times. Uh, I don't want to either miss a family meal or if the family meal is a meal X, maybe having to eat some restrictive diet that is different from what everybody else is eating. So usually fitting my runs in amongst all those usual day-to-day family constraints is quite interesting. And it either means, as you mentioned, it's not when I like to go for a run, but often I just realize once I've had breakfast and once the kids are at school, it's probably the best time of day for me to go for a run. And the issue with that can be the post-run nutrition because by the time I'm finished, it's getting closer to meal times. And sometimes I'll have a big protein shake and I'll throw creatine in there. And sometimes I throw some oats in there. But then come lunchtime with my wife, I'm kind of full. So every day is a little bit different. Um, what I guess my one question for you is one thing I've been doing recently. I tend to get energy bursts on some days in the evening once everybody's asleep, and I go for really good runs. How would you advise I look at post-run nutrition when I'm going for a run at, let's say, 10 p.m., finishing at 11 p.m., and literally showering and going to sleep? Right now, I'm just drinking water with electrolytes, then going to my bed. I'm aware that's probably bad. Um, how could I be doing this better?
Yeah, that's an interesting scenario you bring up, and I think there, because you're running, say, at 9 or 10 p.m., I think what that means is that you've gone the whole day and you've probably had, 3 square meals and you've hydrated pretty well. So from that standpoint, when you finish that run, you're not totally depleted because, you've eaten well during the day, you've hydrated. And so I think that while it's not ideal that you're going to bed maybe without having eaten anything, I think as long as you hydrate, maybe get some electrolytes in, you're probably okay, especially, I guess it would also depend on when you plan on exercising the next day. If you're going to wake up in the morning and run again, which I assume you're probably not because that would be a quick turnaround, but let's say you are. If you're going to wake up again and say run in the morning around 8 or 9 a.m., I would either one, make sure you get maybe at least a protein and carbohydrate, like an energy bar after your nighttime run before you go to bed, or when you wake up in the morning, make sure you eat something before your run because you don't want to go 2 runs without having had anything in between there. But if, say, you exercise and you finish your run at 10, went to bed at 11, and you don't plan on running until the next day, maybe at 3, until 3, 4, 5, I think you'll be okay because you're going to wake up, you're going to have breakfast, and then you're probably going to even have lunch before that next run. So in terms of the glycogen perspective, you're not going to be that depleted. You're going to rehydrate plenty in between those runs. So yeah, what you're doing is not ideal, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily detrimental, and I think you're fine there in terms of how you're approaching that. And I think that gets to a larger point as you were discussing sort of your run structure in terms of how it fits into family life and how it fits into the overall structure of your day. What most runners need to realize is, yes, we just spent the last 45 minutes talking about the importance of this 4 hour window after exercise. Yes, it's important because that's really when your body is sensitive to all of this stuff. It's going to absorb training, it's going to absorb nutrition better to help optimize. We love using this word. I use it way too much, but we love, this is how you optimize your adaptations. But in reality, how consistent you are from day to day in your nutrition, in your training, and just doing things right most of the time without really worrying about the specific timing. That's really what is important. And so, we're really getting into the details here, which is fun. It's fun to get granular in terms of sports nutrition, but in reality, you're running, you're eating well during the day, and that's really what's going to really matter in the end, not necessarily whether you perfectly timed your creatine and protein and ashwagandha after your workout. That's not going to really make or break any athlete, unfortunately. Or
And
fortunately, perhaps.
I almost think this 4 hours framework is a toolkit that's especially relevant for probably many people listening to this like me that are time pressed and maybe can't optimize absolutely everything. The post-run nutrition thing can be an afterthought, or it can kind of lead to decision fatigue where you end up being like, maybe go for a run later just before lunch and then I can do this. And this just gives you a nice little checklist to run through in terms of, okay, if you are just squeezing in a run at this time, consider this along with everything else. The one other thing I forgot to mention is I'm in Madrid, Spain, and it's getting into summertime, so it's almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit some days in the peak of the heat. So timing with that stuff can be difficult as well. Obviously, electrolytes become more important, but it's just another aspect that I think if you could advise anybody, morning runs are probably the best way to get all this right. If you can be consistent with morning runs, it sets you up for the day and is the easiest way to incorporate all this post-run nutrition, the checklist we've been through.
I think so too. Yeah. I think most runners tend to be morning runners, and that's, not everybody, but yeah, that really gives you the ideal kind of opportunity to do all these things because most people are, they're doing a run and then maybe they're going to work or if they work from home, but you often have a few hours where you're just sitting at your desk or something where you can really focus on hydration, focus on the nutrition before life in the day gets in the way of everything.
Brady, these guys that wrote the review paper have an app or a web calculator thing, right?
They do, yes. So it's a web app. It's a calculator, and I think if people probably just searched 4R's Sports Nutrition app. It's not really a website, so I can't really like mention that. But yeah, they have an app, and essentially you can go evaluate the quality and safety of your supplements. You can discover your 4Rs for optimal recovery. So right now I'm on the site, or I went on beforehand, and you can basically put in how much you weigh, what your sport activity is, and the intensity and duration of your general activity, and they kind of spit out this fun recommendation in terms of how much protein you need and when you should eat it. So it's very interesting, and I would encourage people to check it out. I'm sure we'll link the study that we've just chatted about in the show notes here, and if you are, click on the study, they actually have a link to the app in the study, but we can put a link to the app as well in our show notes. So it's a fun little tool people can go to calculate certain things. You can also calculate your allostatic load based on your training. So if runners are interested in playing around with that, I would give a shout out to the creators of that app and the authors here and encourage people to go check that out.
Perfect. I'm going to go and check it out right now. Anything else we should touch on?
Thomas, I think we pretty much covered everything that I had today. What I think is fun about the 4Rs, we discussed this framework, but it's very customizable. We gave pretty precise recommendations today, which I think are great, but I think what would be fun for a lot of people to do is like make this checklist and personalize it to yourself. So maybe maybe you have a certain thing that you like to eat after exercise. Well, make yourself a checklist and like check off that box when you've eaten it, and then make sure you get your electrolyte drink and make a checklist. It can just be something that runners love lists and love quantitative metrics and things like that, or at least most of them do. So if people, I think I would encourage people to maybe actually make a physical checklist to try to get these things right and do it for a month and see if your training improves, if your subjective recovery improves. You can't really know if you're improving without enacting something or measuring it. So do a checklist, practice the 4 R's, maybe look at your stress scores and things like that in your app and see if they're changing. Might be a fun way for people to apply everything that we have just talked about today.
Great. So we'll link to the app, the review paper, and we'll I think we've got some bullet points that basically are almost a checklist that runners could borrow from and reference that we can link to too.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Thanks for your time, Brady.
Yeah, Thomas, another fun discussion. I found this really interesting, and thanks for sharing all of your own experiences, and hopefully people found this one interesting.
Yeah, you too. It has given me a lot to reflect on, and when planning my runs, post run nutrition is often an afterthought or something that's just squeezed in, and now I've got more of a framework. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Cool.